Welcome to the debate presented by the global WarWatch network. For over 60 years, the legendary MiG-21 has ruled the skies. It's been loved as, well, a supersonic icon, yet also feared sometimes as the infamous flying Coffin. As this workhorse fighter, which entered Indian Air Force service way back in 1963, is finally being phased out, its story is, well, it's rightly seen as a mix of triumph and, yes, undeniable tragedy.
Indeed. And I think the sheer longevity, 60 years, it really forces us to confront some difficult questions. Questions about the true cost paid for keeping it flying, especially, when you measure that cost in human lives.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our central question today. Was the MiG-21's legacy in the Indian Air Force fundamentally one of, let's say, unparalleled operational triumph and vital strategic strength, or was it actually defined more by inherent, perhaps unforgiving design flaws and, frankly, excessive sacrifice? Now, I'll be defending the MiG-21 as a historical warrior, really an indispensable platform that guaranteed India's necessary success through decades of instability and, importantly, resource constraints.
And I'll be approaching it from a slightly different angle. While I certainly acknowledge its combat history, my focus is going to remain squarely on the operational risks. The profound technical shortcomings that come with forcing a 1950s interceptor design to serve well into the 21st century, a reliance that, I believe, tragically justified that very grim nickname, the Flying Coffin.
Okay, so the initial induction of the MiG-21, it was nothing short of a strategic revolution for India. Really, it didn't just transform the IAF's air power capability overnight. It fundamentally altered our entire defense landscape. You have to remember, this was right after the 1962 conflict. There were immediate resource shortages, huge foreign exchange constraints, and this deal with the Soviet Union, it established this, well, lifelong bond. It gave India access to technology, crucially, localized production, things Western nations were holding back. So this wasn't just buying a plane. It was, you could argue, a nation-building exercise. And when it was tested in combat, it delivered. It earned that nickname, the Saber Slayer, in the Eastern Theater of the 71 War, quickly establishing air superiority over Pakistan's F-86 Sabres. It was robust, it was reliable, and critically, it never let India down in combat.
Okay, I hear the strategic necessity argument, but I'm just not convinced that absolves the aircraft of its inherent dangers. I mean, that foundational 1950s design was laser-focused on one thing: raw speed, Mach 2 capability. But to get there, the designers made some really profound aerodynamic compromises. Those thin, highly swept delta wings, brilliant for supersonic flight, sure, but they made the aircraft notoriously unforgiving at lower speeds. This meant extremely high takeoff and landing speeds were, mandatory. Not like conventional fighters. Early pilots were explicitly warned, the MiG-21 wouldn't tolerate a soft landing. You had to bring it down hard and firm. Now, that isn't really a feature of a stable, forgiving aircraft. It's a design trade-off that pushed the required pilot skill level up to, frankly, a dangerous degree.
Right, but regarding that nickname, the Flying Coffin, I think that argument is fundamentally flawed by just a basic misreading of the statistics. Look, the IAF operated over 800 MiG-21s, most built under license in India. For decades, they made up more squadrons than any other single type in the inventory. So statistically, any aircraft used in that sheer volume, flying hundreds of thousands of hours, it's naturally going to feature prominently in accident reports. To blame the design wholesale rather than considering the massive scale of operations is, I think, to ignore the inherent risks of combat flying in high-performance jets generally.
Well, I grant the point about the sheer volume. That doesn't just excuse the underlying design flaws that, I'd argue, compounded pilot error. It was the difficulty of the machine itself that translated that high operational volume into tragedy so often. Think about the early training. Pilots were thrown into Russian language immersion, enduring harsh, isolating conditions in minus 20 degrees Celsius sometimes, transitioning directly from slow prop trainers to this Mach 2 interceptor. The unforgiving nature was almost institutionalized from the start, and this difficulty, it places the MiG-21 firmly in a pretty high-risk lineage shared by other early supersonic jets. Most notably maybe the American F-104 Starfighter, The F-104 earned the exact same nickname, the Flying Coffin, because of its own high loss rates early on. That's a clear signal, isn't it?
That these high-performance, single-engine, delta-wing designs of that era, they demanded a level of precision that just made them intrinsically hazardous when you deployed them so broadly and for such extended periods.
Okay, let's maybe shift the focus from just the early design to the aircraft's incredible adaptability. I mean, its longevity wasn't just passive service. It was about constant, proactive modernization. India didn't just operate successive variants, the FL, the MF, the BIS. It fundamentally transformed the platform over time. And the deep modernization program, specifically the Bison upgrade in the 2000s, that was critical. Putting in modern radar, integrating the R-77 Beyond Visual Range missile, that allowed a 1950s airframe to credibly engage and threaten fourth-generation adversaries. Its enduring utility is why I sometimes liken it to the Kalashnikov rifle. It became this ubiquitous, globally reliable brand for affordable, sustained air power. That's a strategic achievement in itself, you know?
That's an interesting analogy, the Kalashnikov. But the problem with adapting, let's say, an old rifle for modern battles is that its core mechanism remains structurally limited, right? You can put modern electronics on the MiG-21, sure, but you can't really change the underlying 1950s structural rigidity or the frankly cramped ergonomics. Those constraints just persisted: poor environmental controls in the cockpit, limited pilot visibility, and, maybe most critically, the sheer difficulty of heavy maintenance. For instance, just to service or access the engine, especially the later, more complex R-25300, the technicians often had to remove the entire tail fuselage section. That's not simple.
Wait, hold on. That specific design feature, the sort of comb-like rear loading engine access, that was actually pretty typical of early Soviet designs, like the Su-7 as well. The idea was it simplified engine removal and replacement in austere field conditions. So you could argue it actually speaks to its intended operational resilience, not necessarily a structural flaw hindering maintenance.
Operational resilience, maybe, but arguably at the expense of long-term maintainability and ground crew effort. When an airframe is pushed way past its intended structural lifespan, as the MiG-21 undoubtedly was, the frequency of things like leaks, cracks, metal fatigue, issues requiring those heavy maintenance jobs, it increases exponentially. This meant ground crews were repeatedly forced into what was described as backbreaking work, fixing one structural issue only to potentially risk stressing other components during that really intrusive maintenance process. So, its longevity, I'd argue, was achieved partly through institutional overuse of a design whose maintenance demands had become dangerously out of step with its age.
But its continued use, surely, was predicated on sound economic reality. It provided a robust Mach 2 capable Air Force at a much, much lower per unit and operational cost than anything comparable at the time. Just compare the MiG-21's cost to acquiring and running a fleet of, say, American F-16s or European Mirages back then. The budget constraints of a developing nation like India simply necessitated this choice. And furthermore, the establishment of overhaul facilities, the BRDs, that mastered the complexity of the engine evolutions, the R-11, the R-13, and the more powerful R-25-300, that created a self-sustaining defense infrastructure. This localization, this ability to repair and overhaul in-country, kept the cost of readiness manageable and guaranteed service continuity. That's a strategic asset that imported Western jets often don't provide to the same degree.
I'm sorry, I struggle to accept that the cost was merely financial. The high loss rate, which, let's be honest, saw tragic peaks as pilots grappled with that incredibly steep learning curve. That points to a prohibitive human cost. You mentioned the economic rationale. Okay. But what's the economic value of a highly trained pilot lost in, say, a structural failure or a training mishap that the unforgiving flight envelope directly contributed to? The lack in some variants of tandem trainers, forcing pilots to transition directly from much slower, more forgiving subsonic platforms, that severely exacerbated the danger. That to me is a direct cost of relying so heavily on an inherently high-demand airframe.
Okay, but are you discounting the pilot's responsibility entirely here? A high degree of mastery is required for any high-performance aircraft. And the statistics, they also have to account for things like engine failures, which aren't always directly tied to the airframe's fundamental design. Plus, the continuous evolution of the engine, particularly getting to the R-25-300, that provided significantly higher thrust. It improved takeoff and climb performance, which actually mitigated some of the low-speed handling risks inherent in the earlier variants.
No, I'm not dismissing the skill required at all. I'm highlighting the machine's profound intolerance for that inevitable moment of human error that can happen to even the best pilot. And yes, while the R-25-300 improved raw performance, it also increased the operational complexity and the thermal stress on an already aging airframe. The constant need for those specialized overhaul facilities you mentioned, to me that speaks less to routine maintenance simplicity and more to the necessity of treating a complex, aging machine with incredibly intensive care just to keep it flying safely. The cost wasn't just the initial purchase price. It was the institutional fatigue, the sheer effort imposed by decades of sustaining such a challenging platform.
All right, let's pivot back to its core purpose, military utility. Its dual-role capability was absolutely indispensable for the IAF for decades. It proved fierce in air-to-air combat. I mean, shooting down 28 Sabers in 1971 is testament to that. And it was equally robust in the ground attack role, carrying a variety of ordnance, 500-kilogram bombs, S-24 rockets, plus the effective GSH-23 cannon on the Biz variant. And the later Bison upgrade further expanded this utility. The enhanced navigation and weapon systems were effective enough that they even permitted operations from semi-prepared runways and potentially even civil airports if needed, underscoring its continued strategic flexibility for dispersed operations.
That's a fair point regarding its versatility on paper, but we have to consider the tactical limitations, especially in a more modern context. Despite its raw speed, the MiG-21 had a critically limited combat radius. Deep penetration missions or sustained combat air patrols were always challenging. And perhaps more importantly, for that ground attack role you mentioned, it lacked precision. The absence of guided air-to-ground missiles meant complete reliance on unguided, dumb bombs and rockets, which drastically reduces effectiveness in complex environments or against moving targets. Furthermore, its high speed combined with that constrained visibility, particularly in the older variants' cockpits, made detecting small, low-flying, or camouflage targets very difficult. That significantly lowered its operational value in counterinsurgency, or close air support scenarios where precision is absolutely paramount.
But that's precisely why the Bison upgrade was undertaken. The integration of Western avionics, including a robust radar, advanced GPS, navigation systems like the Garmin GTN 650, that directly address the sensor and navigation deficits inherent in the original 1960 suite. You can't really criticize the platform for deficiencies that were ultimately successfully rectified through a combination of indigenous effort and international collaboration, extending its effective utility by decades.
I would frame that modernization very differently. The very necessity of installing complex, off-the-shelf Western avionics onto the airframe, isn't that a glaring testament to the fundamental inadequacy of the original Russian avionics suite for modern warfare? These were essentially patches applied to an obsolescent sensor platform. We're talking about retrofitting essential navigation gear onto an airframe designed when, mission computers basically didn't exist. So while the upgrade certainly gave it new teeth, like the R-77 missile capability, the fundamental limitations, the limited internal fuel capacity, the poor low-speed handling characteristics, the restricted visibility, those remained fundamental tactical constraints that no avionics upgrade could truly solve. The aircraft demanded absolute mastery, but offered very limited forgiveness, making it, I would argue, increasingly a liability in an environment dominated by more stable fly-by-wire aircraft and advanced sensor fusion.
Conclusion. Look, at the end of the day, the MiG-21's legacy is, I believe, definitive. It was a fighter that delivered glory when India needed it most. It served as both the symbol and the engine of India's air power transformation for decades.
It ensured strategic independence by fostering that vital indigenous production capability, and it provided unparalleled service continuity and necessary military punch at an affordable cost, fulfilling defense roles when truly advanced, affordable alternatives were simply not on the table. It wasn't a flying coffin, it was an adaptable, often victorious warrior.
And while it undoubtedly inspired fierce, maybe even necessary loyalty among the pilots who did master its incredibly challenging nature, we just cannot overlook the devastating statistical reality of the operational losses. This was tragically underscored, I maintain, by the aircraft's unforgiving flight characteristics, its poor ergonomics, and the institutional reliance on an aging platform that had structurally and technically long passed its intended prime. That extended service life, driven perhaps by necessity and cost, ultimately magnified the sacrifice demanded by this Mach 2 relic, leaving us to remember the pilots who paid the ultimate price for what was, fundamentally, a technological compromise.
The silhouette of the MiG-21 is indeed etched forever in military history, forcing us, I think, to recognize the profound strategic success it represented for India over such a long period.
And it forces us equally to weigh that triumph of enduring strategic utility against the very real human cost of technical compromise and prolonged institutional reliance on aging technology.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this rigorous discussion.
Yes, thank you for your time and participation today.
We politely ask you to like, share, and subscribe to the Global WarWatch Network if you found this interesting.
And please do share your own thoughts on the MiG-21's complex legacy down in the comments section. Also, join us on social media. All the links you need are provided in the description below.